This is Season 2, Episode 11 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight, using lore and knowledge skills, or how to use lore that doesn't dump. Hey everyone, welcome again to Mastering the RPG, tabletop RPG podcast. Like I said, we'll give you advice, ideas, cool stuff found, emails, all sorts of good stuff. I'm Carl with my co-hosts Eric and James. You can find all our information at masteringtherepg.com. That's all one word. Send us email with feedback or questions, or just tell us where you listen to it and how you listen to it, all that good stuff. Anything you want to tell us at gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. That's gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com. Hey guys, it's great to be on the mic once again with you. How Eric and James, how are you doing? James, what's been going on? How you doing?
Oh, going on very well. Thanks, Carl. Living a gamer's life at the moment. Lots of games running amok. I spent almost all of yesterday creating virtual tabletop maps, which seems to be a part of my life now. So sitting in on Dungeon Draft, creating maps, which is good fun. And a really successful week of games, I've got to say. I had a bit of a rough start, but by the end of it, we had a lot of fun by the last game of the week yesterday. So busy all the time, running Dungeons and Dragons, running Call of Cthulhu. It's an exciting time. And I'm off to Oz Comic Con in 2 weeks, doing a couple of days of working for Chaosium for Call of Cthulhu, running a little one-shot to introduce people to both tabletop role-playing and also Call of Cthulhu. So I've got to put the finishing touches on my safari suit for my cosplay for Oz Comic Con for a couple of weeks' time, which is a bit of fun. Yeah.
Fantastic. Eric, how about you? What you been up to?
More of the same. Games ending, games starting. Still working on my thing, but I've just had some other stuff going on, so taking longer. And then part of that is actually about the lore, which you can get caught up in. So it'll be good to talk about. Apropos. Yeah.
Are you falling into the trap? Are you writing an encyclopedia of lore for your game lore, Garrick?
No, but yeah, I can do that, so it's very interesting. But no, I'm not. I wrote a lot of lore that specifically had to do with the player options. Well, I guess we'll talk about this in the episode because we're kind of moving ahead.
Don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Yeah. So, well, for me, the characters have been. The game that Eric's in, the characters came back home and found out that bad things had happened, and they had to do something about it, and they did. Almost didn't. It was a tough fight, but they I think persevered, and now they'll get a chance to question the folks who have been involved and maybe learn a little bit more. And they're learning a little bit each time, and getting, I think, closer to the end goal, at least in my opinion. I don't know if they feel like they are getting closer to the end goal, but in my opinion, that's how it's going. And other than that, I'm super tired, so I hope I don't fall asleep on the microphone. So, and this is all nothing to do with gaming. So it's all like,
unlike James, who lives in Upside Down world and it's wintertime, we're in the summertime, and I think me and Carl, both of us, have been doing a bunch of yard work recently. So
yeah, and I'm an old man.
Physical labor? What the hell?
I know.
Yeah, this old man doing physical labor, it tires me out. And then I'm chasing my granddaughter around, so that tires me out too. So that's just the way it is. So anyway, hey, that's cool. It sounds like a lot of good stuff going on. Today we don't have a cool stuff.
I have a very quick cool stuff. We want to
do you? Yeah. Hey, wow. Right.
I just thought of it.
Right off the cuff. Pants. All right. Yeah.
This one is a Patreon that I belong to, and both of you remember the maps that I used in Agents of Woe. The guy's name is Solution Maps. He by far has the nicest, coolest, both static and animated maps, and he's only been getting better. And why I'm talking about it now is because normally he did science fiction, cyberpunk mostly, and some post-apocalyptic maps. And now he has a whole new channel of fantasy maps.
Oh wow!
And they're just beautiful. And he does, like, when you get a pack of maps from him, he'll have multiple maps that can connect, including those scenes. I don't know if you guys remember. Like he'll draw out scenes, so it's like scenes from a first God, first perspective. Yeah, from the character's perspective, so you can see the map from different dimensions, and it's by far the nicest Patreon, and it's not that expensive, so I highly recommend. I think it's Solution Maps and Solution Fantasy.
So is his Patreon cover both, or is there a separate Patreon?
No, there's separate. So there's a Solution Maps for cyberpunk science fiction, and then there's a separate one for fantasy. And I got in right at the ground floor for the fantasy. I think it might still be that way. So it's like cheaper now if you like join, because he doesn't have a big library like he does for the cyberpunk one. And he does like, once you join, you get like the normal kind of maps that are like every 2 weeks or something. I can't remember if it's every week or every 2 weeks. And then when like you get the backlog, but then his really, really big maps you can only get once you're a Patreon. And those are like things that he sells on RPG at home no, that's Drive Through RPG.
Thank you for the plug, Eric. Appreciate that.
You're welcome. Drive Through RPG for like $5, and then you get them for free once you're a Patreon. Those are like the big maps. If you guys remember the bowling alley, which was like had multiple maps, that was one of his big maps. So yeah, the motion is excellent. Everything about it is just really cool. So that's my cool stuff.
Oh, that is pretty cool.
There goes another $5 a month. Thank you. I'm
You're welcome.
Solution.
Welcome.
They look amazing. I've just
been
logging on while you're talking, and just gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Really, really pretty stuff.
And he does like, you can get it in different like 1080p. You can get it in like super HD. You can get it like in lower res for like browser. You get it in different file types. He really covers the gamut. So yeah.
Oh, very cool. And that's $5 a month. Is that right?
$5 a month for the lowest tier.
$3. Yeah, I guess it's $5 now. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, sorry, Australian could be 5,000 shekels or whatever you call it over here.
It's 3 or 5. I don't know. When I joined it early, so it was 3, but it might be $5 a month now. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. All right. Well, thank you for that off the cuff cool stuff, because that definitely is cool stuff. All right. So let's go ahead and hit the main topic. All right, everybody, welcome to the main topic. Again, we're all about talking about using lore and knowledge skills. So I'm looking at the guys on the screen and I'm confused. But anyway, so we'll get to the main topic, and I think I'm going to run through this a little bit and take the lead on it this time. And so let's start with campaign lore. So what do we mean by lore? What is lore when we talk about an RPG game and campaign? And I'm going to kick it over to James, who's making maps right now. So kind of building out lore in a sense. So tell me a little bit about it.
Building out lore. What is lore? What is lore? Lore is information within the world, I guess, is in a shortest thing possible. When I think about lore, I think about the history, I think about the religion, science, the politics of a place, some of the esoteric lore, some of the hidden occult knowledge that might be in your game world. Could be information about your different societies, different groups within the world. It's basically information about the world that we try and reveal to our players, or players try to discover. In some ways, it's a bit like the exploration pillar when we talk about the 3 pillars of gaming: exploration, role-play, and combat. In some ways, I think lore is like the exploration pillar, where you're exploring information about the world around you. In the simplest terms, campaign lore.
Oh,
I would say that was very good. But I feel like for me, lore is so broad that it really does, it can suffuse all pillars of play. And we talked about it last time for Interesting Combats, how you can insert lore, and you can certainly insert lore in social stuff too. But you're right, it's obviously mostly for exploration, but because it is the world building, right? It's the set dressing, it's the props, right? It's kind of there everywhere. It's there at all times.
and there's different types of lore. So it's all those things are discoverable and understanding, but there's the things that the character know as being part of the world. So they just know it, right? They're part of the world. Yeah. There's things that the characters know that it's from their past. They're from a certain area in the world. They're from a certain society. And so there's things that they know. There's common knowledge that pretty much everybody knows, or people of the different areas. So when they visit, it's easy to discover this information. And then there's the secrets. Right, there's the underbelly. I don't know what the right way to saying, but there's the secrets of the world that are revealed during play. And I think that's something that we'll dig in a little bit later, really, because that's kind of, as players discover lore, that's part of what they discover, right? Is these secrets and parts of the world that they don't just know or recall. So we'll definitely talk a little bit about that.
Yeah,
that's
or
right.
Like
And
impossible for
obscure
them to
knowledge.
know, right? Yeah, it's impossible for them to know because nobody knows it or very few people know, and you've made that decision as a game master, right?
Yes.
I think when we're talking about the mechanics, this comes up a lot with what people roll, how do they, if they roll, what they get. But there's some lore that's just going to be, there's just no possible way for them to know it, right? Because it's that's the function
I think there's three of these tiers in there. Common knowledge, where everyone should know it. There's almost like specialist knowledge. And when you think, in our world, you study, further study, you go to university, or you do a trade or something like that, where you're accumulating knowledge, less personal, less common, more obscure knowledge. And then there's the secrets of the world, which are unknown until you delve very deeply into it. Yeah.
Although Carl made the good point, so it's not always about studies, right? There's sometimes you have a special lore. If you grew up in the northern climates, and like in a Viking society, you might know about the mythology of that more than somebody else would, just because you grew up with it. So I don't know if that's common knowledge is covered by So, anyways,
well, it's common to you, but not necessarily common to everybody,
other people,
right? Yeah.
Or you have something unique in your backstory, right? Like you were visited by a god, or you had an experience with some type of creature that would give you insight into that other people don't. Right.
Exactly. So all that information that we talked about is part of the lore of the world, and how you understand the information within the world. So, but the whole point of this is, right, it's part of the game. So as a GM, or even, I guess, later as a player, we talk about that a little bit, but as a GM, how do you use it? What's the whole purpose for, we sit down and we write copious notes about the lore of our world and information about it, and then players create backstories that have their own lore that they were bringing into the campaign? Why the heck are we even bothering with that? Who wants to jump in on that?
I will. Why do you bother? For me, lore is the texture. It's the rich background to your entire game world. You can describe what the world looks like, but it's that extra level of information which encompasses the ancient civilizations in your world, the rich complexity of different religions, the way that politics meshes together, the way that different groups, the anthropology of your world. It is all that base information that provides a richness to your campaign world and it makes it unique to every different games master and how they portray their world. I mean, part of the beautiful thing about tabletop role-playing games is we create rich worlds that are entirely different to everyone else's. And it's through in a great part because of the lore of the world, because of the details and the information that we present to our players that makes our worlds unique to everyone else's world. And I think it's a great strength to what we do that other media, computer games and board games don't get the opportunity to do. I think it's one of the things that sets our hobbies apart from others.
Yeah, and I think it makes the world feel alive and vibrant. Things like maps. Yeah. Maps are a static representation of the atlas of the world, but the lore is what makes it the world, right? It's really what makes it feel alive, a vibrant, a different place, like you said, James, a unique. It's something that you want to go and explore because there's information out there that you want to learn. That's not just, I want to go to a place that's on a map, right? There's stuff I want to discover and learn.
Yeah, it makes it feel real. I mean, that's what world building does for books, right? It makes it feel lived in their societies, and like you said, there's unique. I think a other part of it is also it informs the narrative of games, like the type of games that you're playing in. When players get exposed more to the lore, then they can kind of, this is the type of game we're playing. If you're in a world that is, there was an empire that's fallen, and the undead came in here, and this lands are wasted, and so then you get the feeling of, this is going to be more of like a grim, dark game, right? This is going to be more gritty because that's what kind of the society that I'm in is more of a gritty society, and these factions kind of give you, oh, it's this type of game. It's a war game. It's a game where we're fighting against an evil, or it's a war where the underdogs. Like, you can say that to players, but really it takes shape once they start discovering more and more of the lore. And I think that's one of the best ways is to really, because it furthers the plot, right? It informs the plot a lot. And that's how game masters use it too, is to, you'll put out little seeds and hints about what you want the plot to be, often through lore, that either them discovering it or coming upon things. I mean, Carl, you use that a lot in your games. You love,
My games are all about finding, or a lot of them are about, there's secrets that are out there that the players learn. That's the lore and the rich fabric of the world, the galaxy, the universe that they live in. Yeah,
and often it's like the type of game changes. Like in the most recent game we're playing, like coming up, I thought it was going to be more of a kind of not normal, but like planet hopping science fiction game. And once we started discovering more stuff, and we're like, oh, that is not the type of game this is. Like, we were kind of seeing it with the way our encounters were, but once we started discovering, oh, there's like some basically, universal conspiracy almost like going on, that things are not what they seem. And like, once we started getting more information, it like really changed the way like our characters were reacting and we're building towards, and how I even saw the game as a whole. Like, oh, this is not that type of game at all. So that was all because of lore, that way that he introduced the lore to the players.
And some games really focus hard on it. I'm running a game called Call of Cthulhu at the moment for Masks of Nyarlathotep, and it's got almost an encyclopedia attached to that module because the background lore of the world is significant. We've got ancient histories, we've got esoteric history, there's a lot of geopolitical in there, and there's a lot of information that you can then present to your players to really give them a good sense of where they are in the world and the forces in the world that array against them. So different games do this in different ways, and some do it, far more detailed than others, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So, and obviously it's, the GMs can use different factions or NPCs or whatever to kind of keep that knowledge out there until it's necessary to move that plot forward, which is kind of like we touched upon a little bit. So
I think the last thing that just wanted to throw this in, the last thing that lore really does, it also informs character options.
Oh yeah.
A lot, like, because even with the same system, like D&D or whatever, the different type of game you're playing, and based on the lore, you might have access to different races in one and not the other, and vice versa, or like new classes or new feats or whatever it is. So lore can really construct, and I'm going through this with building up my own fantasy setting. The lore and the character options go hand in hand for me, and they kind of inform each other and helps me write it. And it definitely, like, once I think of a certain lore thing, that will then kind of narrow down a character option for me. So
that makes sense.
Those are very intermingled too. Yeah.
Yep,
and dictates religions and social castes and all sorts of things. Yeah, absolutely. It presents a whole heap of options for characters to develop.
So we talk now, the GMs, that's how they use it. That's what the reason we have it and what it drives. But oh my God, how do we do it so badly sometimes? It's right in the title, right? Lore that doesn't dump. So how do we do it so badly? What do we do wrong? And that will kind of inform us as to how we make ourselves better. So let's jump right to James. What do we do wrong? I already alluded to one of the things for sure.
Yeah. Oh, look, the biggest trap, and I think everyone does this. I came across a box of old Dungeons and Dragons stuff from when I was a teenager, from when I was 12 or 13, when I first created my first world, and I found a little notebook in it that had 58 pages of the history of my world. I think the biggest trap is we overdo it. We write way too much in terms of background detail, and create these very intricate worlds where we feel like we need to create the history of the world or the religions of the world and write copious amounts of information. And to be fair, look, who doesn't like it? We're in world creation mode. It's a very creative, exciting thing for a games master to do. It's what set the hobby apart. But I think one of the biggest traps that we do is not just is writing too much, in that we create these huge amounts of lore that limit us in some ways.
Yes, exactly.
But then more importantly, we create too much that we then have to interpret to the players. And that can be a real issue, because I think there's nothing worse than these kind of long-winded lore dumps, these monologues of history, where you find yourself running a lecture in some ways, an hour-long lecture to your players about, let me tell you about the history and religions of our ancient lands.
Yeah.
And it's most
oh my God, can it drag a game?
It's really important, that you go so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Right?
That's right.
Well, I think that's what I want to talk about, because I actually think that, I mean, you can go too hard. It sounds like you did. But I don't think that's really the problem. I think it's fine to do a lot of writing as long as you don't have expectations that the players are going to care or actually learn about it. And I think that is the problem. And you touched on that, James. It's like, you can have a lot of lore, and that's fine because it gives that background that you can draw from when you need to, but don't try to force it on the players, and don't expect them to care as much as you do. As long as you're okay with most of it never being heard by the players or used, then it's fine, because, it's like with J.R. Tolkien, right? He did a lot of his writing was world building. I mean, and he didn't include a lot of it in his books. Like, that was just for his own background. So you don't always need to include it all. And I think that's the point that I'm making. To me, the trap really is not so much as how much you write. It's the forcing upon players or getting disappointed. And the other trap is that you might get yourself burned out. And so that's, if you have to know yourself, right? If you're going to get burned out, then don't do that. But yeah, for me, it's definitely the forced exposition, like you guys said, and the, expecting players to care, I think.
But one thing when you write a lot, just that I find, is then you don't have the ability to adjust on the fly, because we talk about a lot on adventures that you have to be able to, as the players lead you. Sometimes too, lore has to change, right? As the players are making changes, like, you know what, that religion really isn't how that religion works, and so you just have to be willing to kill your darling too as you go along.
Yes.
So
that's exactly the point. But again, it's not like that you wrote too much. It's that people don't want to change it, or they,
Right,
I think that's the really point, is that you can write stuff, but be willing to change it, be willing to not ever let it be heard by anybody at all. So I think that's the main thing. But yeah,
I think also there's a tendency to include a lot of very specific detail in your campaign lore too, and I think there is a trap of listing the bland in some ways, and I can't forget the kind of Star Wars analogy. If you look at the first ever Star Wars movie, there is lore there, but it's very quickly brushed over. I fought with your father in the
intro scroll.
In the game. So Obi-Wan Kenobi says, I fought with him during the Clone Wars. That's it. No mention about what the Clone Wars is. Nothing else. Just a quick, I fought with him in the Clone Wars, and leave it at that. Whereas if you look 3-4 movies later, suddenly there's these huge expositions of trade embargoes and the way that the Empire works, and it gets into this minutiae of detail, which loses all aspect of imagination and all aspect of kind of fantasy. And in the end, you're dictating every little machination of the world, rather than coming up with some cool things that you can kind of throw out there as lore and let the players' imaginations fill in the gaps in a lot of ways. I think one of the traps is getting too detailed, because often it just can be a line or two that is intriguing to people. A good example is, I'm running this Call of Cthulhu game at the moment, and yes, there's a lot of information about various dynasties of Egyptian history, but all the players really needed to know was there was once a pharaoh that wanted to resurrect a dark god, and that was about all that you really need to say, as opposed to full pages of all this detail that you need to write.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. This might be kind of in our next topic, but I think that's the really trick, is let the players be the ones to set the pace of how lore comes out and is disseminated. Like, you say exactly how you said. You say your little like interesting little tidbits, and if they don't want to know more, then that's fine, right? But then one player might want to know more, and then you will then unveil it. And I think that's going to be the best for everybody, is have them be the kind of operator of the chute of the lore chute. Like they have the hand on the lever. Let them decide how much they want to come into the feeding trough, I guess.
Yeah, because if you dump too much, they're just going to miss the flowers for the weeds. If you just dump too much and they'll never pick up on the beautiful parts of your lore.
I think the other big thing about
the metaphors are getting great. I love the shoot of flowers, and you're picking the weeds out, and you're on the conveyor
belt of weeds. You don't like the feeding trough? You don't like a bunch of pigs in a pen with the feeding trough?
Eating flowers. I think it's great.
Yeah. I think for me the biggest thing, especially as a player, is when I see this as the biggest, and we've definitely talked about this before, is that when you rely way too heavily on it to be the thing that actually does keep the narrative going, or that does like go from the next scene, is that they had to discover this one thing and they had to do research and they had to know about this to kind of move the plot forward. And I think it can be a good device, but you don't want to become over reliant on it, and you never want it to be the only thing. And I think that can also be a trap. It's like if you get too bogged down in the lore being the whole mechanism to move the narrative forward, you're also going to get tripped up often.
I was talking to one of my players this week. I went up to lunch with one of my players, and I this came up about lore and about the drip feeding of lore and how much information that you provide the player. And he said to me, he's playing in a Call of Cthulhu game, and he's saying one of my fears is that we're spinning wheels, that we're not learning accurate information that will actually help us succeed against the enemy and against the big bad. And in some ways, I think that there's a few levels of this. There's information that you must present in order for the storyline to continue. For the story to go, you've got to provide some of this plot in lines and some lore within the game. But that's the stuff that needs to be freely available, that you don't limit behind dice rolls, and you don't make obscure knowledge. Then there's kind of the extra information that makes beating the bad guy easier. So understanding more about the history or the religion or the politics then makes the success more likely and easier. And then there's the really obscure stuff, which was kind of the do not pass go, collect $200 kind of information, that if you're successful in finding the really obscure stuff, well, that should then lead to high successes in the game. So if you link lore success and the obscurity of lore with success within the game, then that also seems to work very, very well.
So I think you're running right into it, right? Is so what's the right way of unveiling this information or providing it to the players? So now we know how we suck at it sometimes. What should we do to provide that information to the players? And you already touched upon a couple of things already, but what other things might make sense?
A lot of it's about how we present the information. The monologuing of games masters when you start reading out the history, I think, is a particularly poor way to do it. But there are good ways in which you can present this info. One of them is really through the world. As people explore the world, then there are tidbits of information, and there's how the lore is portrayed around how you describe and how people interact with the world. A good example is religion's a very simple one. If you're looking at a fantasy setting, you arrive at a village. There are two temples here. They seem to have followers that don't get along very well. And one temple is a symbol of this religion, the other temple is a symbol of this religion, and you can tell that one is kind of agrarian about growing things, and the other one is about war. And this town seems to be divided along religion grounds. That's not necessarily a lore exposition and a lore dump, but it allows players to get an understanding about how religion operates within this village, within this place, and then allows them to explore more information. The world itself, and as you describe it, can be very, very good in terms of finding lore. Old ruins are another great one, where you stumble upon a ruin that has ancient writing on the walls, as opposed to me just reading out the history of the world. That's one way.
Eric, what do you think? Do you have a thought?
Well, yeah, I agree with it. In general, I think that's the best way, is to put narrative hooks or interesting hooks or tidbits kind of like fishing lore, out there, and players might take a bite or they might not. But when they do take the bite, that's when players use their own skills, and you can then disseminate because they're the driving force, like we talked about. Now, what I was talking about at the head of the episode, and this is only if you're doing your own setting, where I think you can write a lot of lore is with player options, because that's where players will then, like when I mean like different ancestries, right? Like, so I'm making my own races ancestries in my setting, and there I put a couple paragraphs for each one, because I kind of made them interesting. And there, players, they might not read it, but you're more likely to, because that's something that they're creating for their own character. They want to know about their character. So you can insert lore into things like that. Like, they're probably not going to read, like, if I wrote a whole, if I read a 5-page, like, this is what the world's like, a lot of people probably aren't going to read that. But they're definitely going to read about their class, and they're definitely, I mean, not definitely, but mostly they're probably going to read about their class, and they're probably going to read about their race, right? Because it's like their own personal thing, and they want to know about it. They want to role play. So when you kind of put lore into those, like into the character things, the same thing with like giving characters an item, and you could give them like a magical, if you give them, say, like a magical jacket or a magical whatever breastplate, whatever, you can attach some lore to that when they're doing like when they're identifying it. So things that players care about when it has to do with their own characters, that's a really good way to like sneak in lore, basically, when you attach it to either character items or character options, like I was talking about.
Absolutely. And sorry.
No, jump on in. That's fine. I'll make my point after you jump in. That's fine.
If you think about classes, I immediately maybe think about, say, the world of Dragonlance and Kryn with wizards and how magic's operated. Having red, black, and white wizards based on alignment and how that works. It immediately gives characters a choice about which of the areas they want to get into, and then you're allowed. You can fill it up with lore about the different wizarding schools and bits and pieces. And a similar vein with clerics and paladins with religion. You can right at the beginning of the game, you can present this banquet of lore that they can then choose from when they're creating their characters. Couldn't agree more, Eric. It's a good point.
Yeah, good stuff. And I'm going to just throw a different log on the fire. We're talking a lot about game masters creating lore. You can also source the table, especially when you talk about knowledge that the player would have because of the region or whatever. They can help you define that lore. Even in, like, I did a cyberpunk game where one of the folks belonged to a gang at some point, and it was like, and it might have been you, Eric, and it was like, okay, well, you tell me about the gang. What were they about? Why did they act the way they did? And what was their, and even in the middle of the campaign, one of the other characters was going to, go and find some contact they had or some. It's like, okay, so tell me more about this group this contact belongs to, and what does this group do, and why do they exist? And I just let the player do it, as opposed to it's just some contact that they happen to know. And I think it makes for a rich. And so that goes back to be willing to kill your what you've already defined, and let the players help define it.
Yeah, but it's so much better. Yeah, sorry,
I could not agree more. I could not agree more, because I was thinking about that is, one of the other ways is, like, we always talk about session 0, and when both definitely with James and with you, Carl, like when I'm often making a character, like we'll have a little tete-a-tete, and I'll be like, okay, this is what I'm thinking for my character, and I'll kind of like add, like, where he's from and where they're, and sometimes, like, then that's a really good way to give lore. Like, I remember James with Bisbo, like, and it went both ways, like exactly how you're talking about, Carl, where I said my own things and we created lore from my own mind, and then you also then informed me about lore because it had to do with my area, and that goes back to what I was saying before about character options. But yeah, Carl, I could not agree more about leveraging characters, and even with my setting now, like I'm leaving a lot of stuff open, and I left, like, while I have like some general lore about an area which has like a bunch of, basically, I call it the 100 kingdoms, and it's actually only like 86. But like, I'm not defining most of those. I'm not defining.
Tell me you've written 2 pages on all 100 kingdoms.
No, I'm not. I just a very general. There's like a couple of them that I'm writing a little bit about, but then generally I'm just leaving it open. And this is like, nobody's from there. I mean, my thing is like a colony type of game, so they're not. But if a player wants to be from there, I'm like, okay, create where you're from. I don't care. Like, create the kingdom. Like, and that's, so I'm like leaving stuff open for them to create their own. So Carl, yeah, I 100%. And like when we think about my character now in your game, I created a whole new race that we didn't have before, the Mousekin. We have all these anthropomorphic animals, and then you let me just run with like, oh, they're an agricultural
Yeah, you
society
defined
that
it.
also
You
focuses on
defined
medicine.
what they
Yeah, I
were.
made a whole
Yeah.
yeah, and so that was really cool, and it kind of breathed life. And then also you're letting me unveil it to other people, which is a good thing to do. Like let the players themselves unveil lore, right? Let them, because they'll be excited about it, and that's something I think. I don't know if you guys were also thinking about this. Is that once you know a character's backstory, you can private message them when it's pertinent to their backstory, and then let them disseminate it to the group, right? I think James, you do this a lot. I'm assuming.
Yeah, and look, using players to assist, or not even assist, but to be a partner in the creation of the world's lore is really, really amazing, and it does take you places that you weren't particularly expecting to go. Eric, in our game, it was just a throwaway line. It's like, when we were playing with the Empire and your character's from the Empire, and you're saying, well, actually, they breed these massive hounds that they track down Fey with, and they arm them up, and they're kind of these bionic hounds, and he, very quietly, he said, I hope that's okay, and I'm like, of course it's okay. It adds a whole other layer of information, and often I'll ask players to describe, if we've got a cleric, describe the prayer. Tell us about the religious ritual that you would do in the dawn when you pray to your god. For the fighter, tell us about the mercenary company that ravages the north. So that you're creating these worlds together, and you're not relying on just your own creativity, but the very creative minds that you've got around the table.
And do you ever private message them when, like, if based on a backstory, you'll send somebody a message or like a note if it was on the play? Okay,
absolutely, yeah. Although, and yes, I do that, but to be fair, there is other ways to present lore as well, and perhaps I sometimes think that we miss the obvious one in some ways. Characters have knowledge that you can assume that they know, and we've talked about this a bit, and just providing the characters with that background, straight up knowledge about, you would know this. Of course, you would know because you've studied history. You would know this tidbit of history, and you can actually just hand that over to a player that has put the correct points in certain knowledge skills as well. So there's the use of the knowledge skills, which we'll get into a little bit later, but often just having those points and having a character that's chosen to be an expert in something means that you can use them as a conduit for a lot of this information as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Any other thoughts on how we unveil it, or let's talk about what makes it interesting? How do we make this unveiling of this information interesting to the players now? I think it goes hand in hand with how we unveil it, and we've talked a little bit about what makes it interesting to players because of the sourcing the table and things like that. But it obviously varies from group to group. But Eric, kind of, what do you think is something that we should do as game masters to make it interesting for the players as it gets revealed over time?
Well, I mean, I think what we talked about before is draw from backstories. Like I said, if a character has something that's parallel or directly in their backstory, they're going to be more interested in it, obviously. I think you should always include some type of, like, I think, James, you talked about this before too, like a sliding scale with as far as successes go, and give advantages when they do well, or when they do research lore. Mechanical advantages, or narrative advantages. One of those. I think you should always reward if people are more prepared. I mean, those are some of the ideas. I don't know, Carl. How do you do it?
Well, I think the big one for me is I try to just kind of demonstrate the lore as opposed to just talk about it.
Show and tell.
Yeah, show versus tell. I think James touched on it, right? The cleric comes into town, and there's two temples, and they go to a temple, and they're seeing the rites, and the rites mean something to them, and that informs you somewhat about how this religion works. And later, the players may run into a similar ritual going on, and now they understand where it came from and why it exists, and they can maybe even tie it back to this town that they visited. And so that that was purely without, they didn't have to make a roll or anything. They just, well, maybe there might be a notice check or a perception check to pick up on a little tidbit or something, but they didn't have to do anything other than just watch what was going on and be part of the world around there. So I think that's the big one. And I think you also hit upon it, the character's backstory, and then just telling them things they know that's interesting and unique to them that no one else knows. And so they get that little tidbit. That makes it interesting to them, and then they get the excitement to share it with others, as we kind of mentioned before. James,
I've discovered this fun little one that only recently, and maybe I've been doing it a while, but I'm running Call of the Netherdeep at the moment. And Call of the Netherdeep, which is the critical role module for Dungeons and Dragons, runs a lot of religious information. There's a whole heap of different religions in it, and there's a lot of different opinions on those religions. And one of the cool things I found was role-playing the differences, or role-playing kind of contesting the information, where you end up having role-playing arguments about the lore. Saying, well, the old gods never really existed, did they? Says one NPC, which then prompts the player character to then articulate lore back to you, and then and so or the one true god was this god, and then have another NPC say, that's rubbish, I believe in the time of the ancient pantheon where there were 7 great gods. And you can kind of lore dump without lore dumping, if you know what I mean. If you have an argument or you have a contested belief about the lore itself, this festival is an abomination and it should be banned, or this festival is criminal according to the law, then suddenly you can have an argument about it, which then sinks that information into the psyche a little bit firmer than just you telling about the law. Is another way to make it interesting.
Yeah, and finally for me, there's basically, I have it's 3 things that I think is a really good way, like you were talking about, Carl, about showing, not telling. Where you don't just even lore dump, and maybe later on the characters will investigate it. But basically, you introduce something to the characters that's either really, really cool, really, really weird, or totally really, really horrifying. Like if you do one of those things, they'll often be then they'll really be interested, and it will have a new dimension to it. So what I mean is if you use an NPC that's a real big badass, but he's wearing he's super slick, and he's much higher level than the players, just a really cool character. And then he has maybe he has a certain he belongs to some certain order, and he doesn't really talk about it, but he has an emblem. And then so later on the players might be curious about that because they had such a good impression of him. And this also works with if you have something really weird in your lore, throw it in there at an unexpected time. Have something really weird show up that is what the hell is that? What's this? All of a sudden there's a flying octopus, I don't know, with a top hat. I don't know, not that word. I couldn't think of anything offhand.
A flying octopus with a top hat.
I don't know.
Oh my God.
But then it was an illusion. I don't know. Maybe it's a society of people that I remember I did lore for another game where it was these people who were kind of rebels. So basically there was a colony, and they cultivated this drug for this empire because it was kind of like a coffee, like a more intense coffee, and they were kind of like the workers. But then there was the kind of rebels of them lived out in the forest, and they just ingested this nut raw, and they were just all about illusion magic, and their whole society was based on illusion magic. And that's how they defended themselves, but it's also how they settled arguments. And so to unveil that, I had some weird crap like that just in the distance. Didn't explain it, And that kind of later on, that when they got into it, they're oh, it was an illusion. Just so you can kind of just, or like I said, have something really horrifying. Maybe you weren't thinking that way, but with a certain religion, you might have if there's some type of inquisition going on, have them come upon the tree with just bodies hanging and guts. I mean, if they're not kids for James, but something really horrible.
No, bodies hanging and guts works for kids. Yeah. They don't mind that.
So you could, I just mean shock them with one of those things. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if that made sense. But.
Yeah, I'd like to see an octopus in a top hat coming at me. That would be horrifying, both weird and horrifying.
Weird and horrifying. It's true.
All hail the one true formally attired octopus. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Bow tie and a top hat. Yeah.
All right. So, any other thoughts on that? Because all that is about lore and providing that information and everything. Now we start talking a little bit about more the mechanical implementation, knowledge and investigation skills, and how that becomes a reality in the game. So first off, I guess we talk about what are knowledge and investigation skills, because we all know what combat skills are, right? We whack things with our sticks and stuff like that. So and they're probably different for all sorts of games. So I don't know. What do you think? What's a knowledge and investigation skill entail?
So for me, knowledge and investigation skills are the way characters can drill down into the lore. So if the lore is the encyclopedia of knowledge about the world, then the skills are your ability to read that encyclopedia. So it's either information that a character would already have, or the way that they apply their skills to gain that information, to research that information. Some games are really heavy into this, and some games are not so heavy into it. Again, I'll bring this up because in my mind, it's probably the biggest one, is Call of Cthulhu is a research and knowledge skill heavy game. You can spend as much time in a library as you can on the battlefield in Call of Cthulhu, and they talk about, you name it, there's a skill for it. In some of the expanded character sheets, they have every single science on as a skill. So, no, I've got 12 points in geology, so therefore I understand what geology is. And so some games get right into the detail of the very specific knowledge that a character might have. And Middle-earth role-playing is another one where they got right down into very, very, very specific information about the different survival skills based on the different types of terrain. So that you have different knowledges of surviving in the Arctic and different knowledges of surviving in the desert. But for me, the skills are about how do players access the lore of your world.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because when you say knowledge and investigation, there's really two categories there. There's the kind of book knowledge, and here's where I want to bring up something that I've been thinking a lot about. So Pathfinder 2e came out, and I know they're not the only one that did it, but for me, it really, really changed the way I think about characters and the way they use knowledge skills. And in Pathfinder 2e, for them, it's more about recalling knowledge than knowing knowledge. So when a character makes a check, it's not that do they know it or not, it's that can they recall it or not. And for me, it was a really big kind of sea change, because I think there's a lot of traps. And again, it really does depend on the game, like James said. And some games have very broad skills, right? And some have really granular skills. And Savage Worlds has really broad skills, but they have skill specialization as a variant rule that Carl doesn't like, but it's there.
No, I do not.
It's more very specific, right? But regardless of that, there is a big trap of I have science, or I have arcana. And so I'm going to always roll about everything, because how do I know if I don't know something? But I think that's just the wrong way of looking at it. To me, it's always about you might know something or not, but it's really about you recalling it. Because I think we need to limit players on, they can't always roll. And I think this was something coming up with the new the 6e with D&D, which I'm not going to play, but one of their game designs was kind of like making it even easier for players to gain knowledge through skills. And then in their little bylines, they were like, but don't have them roll if they don't know it. And it's so it's really making GMs gatekeep as far as what players may not know or not know. And I think we've talked about that, right? Like certain backstories, or just because you have a knowledge, I know we might talk about this later, but certain ones might have access to this and others don't. So for me, like I said, it's really about I think you should always look at it more about recalling. As far as when we're talking about the knowledge skills, when the investigation skills, those are there specifically to disseminate clues from the world, right? To find if there is something to then be knowledgeable about. And so they're really, really distinct. where investigation skills are what you rely on if you're hiding the clues from players, and the clues then lead to players making knowledge rolls of some sort.
It's a great distinction between the two of them. Yeah, no, very, very good. Yeah, and I hadn't thought of it that way. And the idea of recalling as opposed to your depth of knowledge, like have you ever learned this, as opposed to do you remember that lesson, is a very different thing. Yeah, very different thing. That's great.
Excellent.
There's another thing I linked to knowledge skills as well, which again, I'm rabbiting on about this game a lot this week. Call of Cthulhu does this really, really beautifully, and it's you use your knowledge skills to understand people within the world as well. A good example is one of my players has got high levels of archaeology and high levels of hieroglyphs. So while in London, use the knowledge skill to understand who might be a good historian or expert in Egyptology that I could meet, or that I might have met, or that I might have read about in order to gain extra knowledge. So using skills not just to understand the lore of the world, but using skills to understand who the NPCs are in the world that might further that knowledge, which is a really cool extra little bit that I've started to use in Dungeons and Dragons as well. You know, you've got high levels in religion. Make a religion roll to see if you recognise any of the high priests within the city, and using that as well to add extra story conduits as well, and to unveil non-player characters.
I mean, you don't know everything, but you know who does know everything, and you know how to find them.
Yep.
Right. So, excellent. So that's kind of the basis, right? So we've got some systems that have very detailed, some systems that are a little more generic, but in the end, we're talking about this knowing versus recalling. So how do we take advantage of that? So James, you talked a lot about your game that has a lot of investigation, research outside of sort of the combat system. You're learning things so that when you go into combat, I'm assuming, or you go into those conflicts, you're prepared for them. So how does knowledge play in the combat setting? What does knowledge bring to combat? Because that's a big part of all role-playing games, right? So does knowledge go out the window? Knowledge skills, forget about them because now we're just pulling our sticks out and whacking each other. What do you think, Eric?
No, I actually think the opposite. I despair a little bit about modern 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and players using intelligence as their dump stat, saying, well, intelligence in combat is the least useful because wisdom you deal with perception, and dexterity and it's all about combat. Intelligence is the least useful skill in combat, and I actively try and work against this because understanding your enemy should be the number one thing that assists you in combat. So in my games, I pair knowledge skills with direct information and understanding about how an enemy might act, what their vulnerabilities might be, and understanding what they might do. And I use this a lot in terms of my games, of allowing players to roll for their characters for information that pertains to a combat. What do I know about goblins and their tactics? What do I know about trolls and their vulnerabilities? And allowing different roles to allow those benefits to be in combat. Because often we talk a lot about, when we talk about player knowledge, this thing about meta knowledge comes in all the time, where as a player I know a lot about that monster, but as a character I don't know. Well, in my mind, knowledge skills allow us to bridge that gap a little bit. They don't have to experience on the battlefield in order to have known what it's about if they've studied. And in a world like a fantasy world where monsters are around the corner, you would imagine that this would be something, if you ever wanted to look up a library, I'm going through this forest next door and I understand there's monsters in it. I might do a little bit of research before I go into that forest because, surely someone survived and lived to tell the tale and written about it. And so using knowledge skills, I think, is integral for making good combats. And games like Call of Cthulhu really dive into this. They have a skill called Cthulhu Mythos, which is a knowledge skill, which is related entirely to knowing the mythos and knowing the creatures that you're going to be defeating, and the accumulation of that knowledge is a major part of the game. So I'm a big fan of knowledge skills leading combat rather than being something that you entirely ignore.
Yes, and again, I'm going to bring up Pathfinder 2e because they basically, and again, it really does depend on your game system, but I think there's things we can learn from that. And the thing with Pathfinder 2e is they completely put lore skills in combat, both because of the amount of monsters there are with weaknesses and strengths, and basically they're weak to certain energy damage or they have immunities, all that stuff. There's rules about that using in-game. You do actions to make knowledge checks to get that information, and it's huge because there's so many monsters. Also, it's completely integrated with class features. A lot of class have feats and features that are related to knowledge checks in combat. So I think we can basically draw from that, as James was saying. So one of the things is having monsters that just are not in the Git book that everybody knows, right? And I think we've talked about that a lot in monster design, is that you can take something like a troll and switch up their immunities. Maybe it's not fire, maybe it's water for this type of troll. And they won't know that. And that's so you have to, basically what it is, you have to incentivize players to do these things in combat, to spend their action economy to do it. They have to have a benefit. And like I said, one of the things is having monsters that don't comport to what they know, what their meta knowledge is, because even if you don't want to meta game, it's hard. When you're fighting a troll and it has regeneration, it's hard to kind of separate, the fire. Like, do I know about the fire thing or not, right? So having different monster things. And like I said, with Pathfinder, there's a lot of options where you do a thing in combat and you then get a bonus if you succeed. And I think that's another thing. If a player chooses to do, even if they know about the monster, if they use a knowledge skill in combat and they succeed, be like, yeah, hey, you remembered a bunch of weaknesses. So your next attack, you get a +1 on the attack roll, or you get to do extra damage on the next attack roll, or you did so well, everybody gets a +1 as you yell out to everybody, hey, this is their weakness. You can give them short-term benefits for actually using it, and that then will incentivize them to then use it in combat, because it is a big ask, and that's why intelligence can be a dumb stat. It's a big ask to be like, yeah, use your action economy in combat for role-playing purposes, when that's like their whole round, right? Now, something like 5e, this suffers because they only have one action. So maybe you do it as a bonus action or whatever. Something like Pathfinder has 3 actions, just like Savage World. So you can kind of leverage that easier. But yeah, I think the number one thing is to give mechanical benefits and to give narrative benefits in combat, like he was talking about. And so making your own monsters really does feed into this a lot.
So yeah, so I think, again, when we talk about, for example, Savage Worlds, and there's multiple things in combat. This is yet now another one, right? In Savage Worlds, you can do tests and support, so you can use other skills to give people benefits. You have obviously the normal combat skills. Now here's another wrinkle: you leveraging knowledge and researching skills and things you might have done to also get benefits. So there's multiple ways that a character who's maybe not typically combat effective can bring benefits to the other folks, and it sounds like Pathfinder 2e codifies that in the rules directly, so that
an insane amount.
Yeah, so definitely we can maybe learn something from it. Yeah, for sure.
And I noticed 6th edition D&D is doing the same thing. They've put a whole heap of stuff in the skills there that give various benefits, but probably not to that extent. But they've definitely lifted a page or two there.
And that's, so you have to, when you're doing this with players, it depends on the system, but they might not know that they get benefits. So this is a time for game masters to be overt about that, to be like, hey, if you want to make a knowledge roll, like I can tell you some, if you're not getting through their toughness, or you're not getting through whatever immunities they have, or you're like, hey, if you make a knowledge roll in combat and you succeed, like I'll give you a bonus. Like tell them, so they know that up front, so they'll be more keen to do that. And then, like we've talked about before, you could then use those times when they ask about, like they're in combat, they want to know about the weaknesses of the monster, they want to know if they get a bonus, right? And then you can use that time, don't go on for very long, but you can give a little tidbit of actual lore too about the world. Oh, this troll has this resistance because they come from this country where they bred them this way, right? So then this is another place where you can insert lore in something that the players are excited about, and it's kind of tying into their mechanical things. So it's not going to feel like you're just being you're not I lost my train of thought, but you're not like being you guys know what I'm
You're not being mechanical only and not being, kind of.
But you're not being preachy. I mean, you're not like
saying.
you're giving it to them while they're getting a treat, right? So you're kind of giving them
you're not dumping.
the bag
Yeah.
with you're sweetening the medicine, as it were. So yeah, that's a good time to kind
You
of
have to take the history lesson, but you'll get something out of it.
Yeah, you'll get a treat. You'll get your lollipop after you get your shot. So
very cool, very cool. So a lot of this has all been kind of game master and what you can do to help the player. So as a player, how do you create a character that's this knowledgeable, investigative character who has that capability and ability? Now, obviously, this is not for everyone, right? Because except in Call of Cthulhu, right? Everybody's an investigator, but in a lot of systems, it's not for everybody to take on that role, and it's just like face characters not for everybody. So here's the kind of the lore master. What does a player do to do that well, if that is something that they're interested in doing? Because there is mechanical benefits you're going to give them. There is knowledge that they'll have that's special that others might not have that they can share and be a spotlight. So what do you guys think? Eric, you're more of a character kind of person, right? You're a player.
Well, I think about right now I'm in a game with you, Carl, and I'm playing basically the knowledge character, right? And then my last game with James, I played the investigator knowledge. I mean, but I wasn't that. Yeah. So I was like both of those characters were very knowledge heavy. And one was an investigator. It's a very interesting thing. I think you have to take the same look at it as a face character in a lot of ways, where first of all, you don't want to hog it. And this is something that I see a lot because it's like when somebody has that niche, like a face character or a knowledge character, they think, oh, I'm the only one that can do these roles, which I just don't think is fair and it's not equitable because everybody contributes in combat, right? Even if you're a knowledge character, even if you're the face character, you also have things to do in combat. So I think one of the things is not to just be a hog. But when I do think you're going in, you just want to know what your base is, right? Like, because you can be pretty broadly knowledged, but to be a successful one, you have to have your specialties. Even if it's not codified in the game system. Like when we think about Bisbo,
Bisbo.
He had his specialties, right? Yeah, Bisbo. I forget his full name now. Bisbo.
What?
I can't remember his full title and name.
Bisbo PI. Yeah.
Bisbo the Hammer. He was called himself the Hammer. He was
the Hammer PI. Thorn PI.
Yeah, he was a kobold who learned from his private investigator mentor. Anyways, he had very specific things that he was interested in. He was an artificer, so obviously anything mechanical was his jam. And sometimes you're forced, right? Sometimes you're forced. Like in our game, Carl, like when I remember at the top, we were like, well, I think I even suggested, I was like, maybe we should have science be a core skill. Core skill, something that everybody gets when they start, like something like stealth. Everybody gets stealth, the lowest stealth when they start a game in Savage Worlds. And we made science a core skill because we were like a scientific kind of a Star Trek.
You're an expedition.
Very cool.
Yeah, expedition. But my character's the scientist, and I'm hyper specialized.
Yeah, everyone else is kind of dumb. It seems like they're just
everybody else is kind of dumb, basically. So I often have to roll. I often have to roll more than I would probably like, but I still try to keep the character within its bounds. Like he has the curious hindrance, but I only kind of let it happen when it's things that he cares about, which is biology. Biology is his main jam. So I make more checks when it has to do with biology, and I activate his hindrance when I think this is a really good flaws to have too. If you're a knowledgeable character, tie flaws into your character's thirst for knowledge because it's really fun, right? To have a flaw either of you're kind of the absent-minded professor type of thing, or you get laser focus on a certain one, or you get really stubborn about your field. So always have your specialty. Even though you can be broad, always have your specialty and really leverage that as far with role playing. I don't know if I'm kind of
it's fantastic, and remembering that not all games masters will remember that you've got certain skills as well. So in my mind, it's important, and I do appreciate it when players will remind me, oh, by the way, I've got this knowledge. I specialize. I am an archaeologist, and I specialize in Egyptian archaeology. So am I able to decipher this information, or can I recall something based on my skill? I think it's important for players to nudge your storytellers when you need to remind them of those specialities when you've got them as well.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely good point, and talk to your game master. Either remind them maybe that something's from your backstory that you might have prior knowledge, or you ask though. You always be like, "Hey, I had this in my backstory. Would I know something about this, or can I roll on this?"
Well, and sometimes you shouldn't even ask for a roll, right? Like to that archaeologist, it's like,
would
can I
know?
decipher this?
Yeah.
You are an archaeologist who knows hieroglyphics. Yes, you can absolutely decipher that, unless there's something unique about it that you have to roll and say, oh, you learn something. If a failure isn't interesting, then and they should just know it, then let them know it. I mean, that's just like I even say that for face characters, right? If you do a good job and you should be able to smooze this person, well, just smooze them. There's no reason to make you roll if it's something you're just competent at, right? Same thing for knowledge, I think.
Definitely.
And there's an important
don't be
thing.
afraid to ask the GM. I think that's the big thing. Either ask the GM of, could I possibly roll in this, or would I know this? Because if you don't want a metagame, right, it's like, would my character maybe know this or have a chance to know this? And that goes back to, for me, recalling not knowing. Like, too, it was like, when you do the roll, it's like your character might know it because of your backstory, but it's really, can they recall it in the moment? Anyways,
and this is important too. You make an important point. If you liken, I liken this to face characters and social skill challenges where you might not be the world's best role player at the table, right? So in the end, you've got to default to your character's skills in being able to persuade someone or be able to intimidate someone or be able to kind of fast talk in a situation. In the similar vein, as a player, I may know nothing about science, zero about biology. And so you have to default to your character, that they are far more knowledgeable than you. And so prompting your storyteller and kind of using the character as the basis to get around some of this meta knowledge. It's a really good point, Eric, about avoiding the meta knowledge by tying it to what your character should and may know. I think it's a really important point.
And then finally, I think it's utilizing it in unique ways, like whatever your specialty is. I find when I really role play with characters, like my character in Carl's game, who's very smart and is a scientist, and like, because I have my own kind of like love of biology and I love space, so I have some knowledge. Me and Carl have a lot of science fiction like similarities, so some of the things I've been jiving on. But generally, like, I find myself when I really role play it, is I find myself not being smarter, but like saying things smarter, like having more ideas about that. When I have a dumber character or a character doesn't care about that, I pretty much don't even think about it. Like, I don't even bother to think about it. I pretty much like, this is what I'm focused on, so I'm not going to even make a guess about this unless it kind of is within my. So basically, what I'm saying is, when you really role play it, you'll find yourself like making rolls when appropriate, or making like assumptions when appropriate, because you can kind of make yourself dumb. Like I remember with Bizbo. I would do some really boneheaded things because he just had huge gaps in his knowledge, and he didn't understand, like, while he was really smart about things that he would research, and he was really smart about arcane and mechanical things, he had no idea about like the history of the world, and of some things, and he had no idea about like cultures and societies, right? And he made like a lot of faux pas. Like, one of the first things I did was like I learned Sylvan swear words from somebody, and then I pissed off like an archfey because I swore at him because like he had no idea. So with smart characters, make them stupid too. They're always going to be stupid over some things, right? I think that's the good, just to balance them out.
Yeah, that old book knowledge versus street knowledge.
Street smarts, yeah.
Yeah, street smarts, right? So. Okay, James, you got any last thoughts on when we talk about creating a knowledgeable character?
No, look, to be fair, Eric's the guy, isn't he? He's the guy who's done so many knowledgeable characters. I'm going to defer to him. No, I've got nothing more to add, Eric. I think you've nailed it.
You nailed it. And overall, I think any other final thoughts? Because I think on this episode, we nailed the topic. For sure. Ben agrees. Yep, the dog agrees. So, or maybe doesn't agree. I don't know what that. I don't speak dog, so I don't have that knowledge skill. I can't make a roll. So, anyway, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherpg.com to learn about our projects. and contact us, support us. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com if you have a question, need some advice, have a comment. Eric would still love to adjudicate some differences of opinion. That would be fun. Please, somebody. And if you like the show, please help us with positive reviews on the podcatcher of your choice. We love doing the show, and we'd love to keep doing it. So send us an email. Tell us if you like what we're doing. Any suggestions, I'd love it. So once again, this is Carl with Eric and James. Say goodbye, guys.
Goodbye, guys.
Happy gaming.